I'm often asked how to epoxy. This is a product I use. It's a resin and a hardener. Mix them together, equal amounts. Stir them really, really well until the product is clear. It starts out cloudy, and when it's mixed completely, it's totally clear. Again, this is a product I like. It has the least yellowing. Some products yellow. So if you're doing white items, you don't want that yellowing. This stays really clear. So then the next step is I pour on the epoxy, a good amount, and then I take a brush and I smooth it out. You have 20 minutes total from the time you start till it starts to harden and you can't work with it. So you have to move quickly. I do quite a few pieces at a time, but you can just do one piece. Use a well-ventilated area. You do not want to breathe this stuff. The epoxy has a beautiful effect on knotholes and wood in particularly. It brings everything to life. It just adds a dimension that a lot of people like. I just started mixing up a second batch. As you can see, it's cloudy. There are lines on the side of the bottles with numbers, amounts, that tell you how much is equal parts. The white bottle isn't showing very well. Okay, I have applied the second batch. So each piece now is covered in a layer of the first layer of epoxy. I do several layers. I elevate my pieces up off my table. Epoxy is like glue. It will stick to whatever it dries to. So I don't want it touching my table or my cardboard. Now the edges, what I do is I go over and I check after I get my layers on. I check my edges to make sure my edges have an even coat. I can either save a little from my batch of epoxy, or I can take the drips and I can use what has dripped. Epoxy is very forgiving. If you have an area it didn't cover, you can go back and touch it up. Most of my stuff I do 3 coats at least. I paint with texture, and to get coverage I need to put on multiple coats. When you're epoxying, it goes through a hot stage right before it starts to set up. And that hot stage is a clue. You only have a couple minutes left to work with it. Now when you're doing bark, sometimes you'll get a little bit in the epoxy. So you can just brush that out and keep working. So after you get your edges all touched up, take and look at your work in the light, and you might see you missed a spot or two. That often happens because it has a glare. It's really hard to see. So you look back, and if there's any spots you missed, you can again touch it up with the drips that have dripped off, or any that you saved and didn't use. So I really stand back and I try and look over each piece to make sure I have the edges covered as well as I haven't missed anything on the surface. You want to wear gloves for sure while you do this. I should have said that in the beginning. Epoxy, you do not want it on your hands. It does not come off very easily. Paint thinner doesn't take epoxy off. You want to make sure you don't wear any clothing that you don't mind getting ruined. Okay, I am now ready for the next stage. Okay, your final stage between each coat is a torch. You lightly go over the piece you've just epoxied while the epoxy is still wet, and you run a blowtorch over it. Epoxy has little teeny air bubbles. The torch removes those air bubbles. You don't want to stay in one place too long or long at all. You keep your torch moving. You do not want to boil the epoxy. Keep your torch moving. And in the light, you'll be able to see the air bubbles popping. When a piece has no more air bubbles, move on to the next piece. It goes very quickly. The air bubbles pop very easily. And again, in the light, it's hard to see probably with the phone camera, but in the light, you'll be able to see your air bubbles popping. If for some reason you can't get your air bubbles to pop, you can lightly brush stroke them and try again. Once in a while, you'll get a stubborn air bubble, but generally they just come right out. The first two coats, I don't worry too much about the surface being perfectly smooth, but my final coat, I'm very particular about it. I'll go over it and look at it and make sure I have everything covered. If you miss a few spots in your first coat, the second coat will just heal it. It will not be a problem. But on the final coat, you want to make sure that the surface is completely like glass. I have had disasters with flies. In the summer when I epoxy, I'll spray the building and make sure I'm bug free. And I've had flies fly into the epoxy, and it is something that you try avoid at any effort, especially that final coat. Okay, everything is removed of air bubbles, and I let it dry 24 hours. I'll put on another coat and then another coat until I have a perfect glass finish. And then after the final drying, on the back of each piece there'll be epoxy drips, and I sand those off or grind those off with a sander or grinder. And then the piece is ready. I hope you enjoy epoxying, and I hope this works for you.